Okay, with this last lecture, we are going to talk about that closing piece. So when you end that initial long meeting with your client, what are you going to be doing? So one of the things that during your meeting you want to do is you want to make sure that you uncover some of your client's values and their vision. And you can do this a little bit with the assessment, but a lot of that's going to come from the conversation that you have with them. So you need to be listening for that sustain talk and then also that change talk. And if you remember, sustained talk is when your client uses language that reflects a desire to stay the same. They want to sustain where they currently are at. Versus when your client starts to talk about things that they can do to change, that's what we call change talk. And so when you listen to that, you're going to respond very strategically based on whether they use sustained talk or change talk so that you can help your client move in that right direction. And either way, whether it's change talk or sustain talk, one of the tools you're going to be using is that reflective statements and reflective listening. And we went over that in much more detail in previous lectures, so I won't here. Just a reminder that that's how you can help uncover the visions and values of your client. So we also want to make sure that we avoid traps of engagement. And it's common for us to do some of these things, and I myself have caught myself in these things, and especially when you're just starting off as a health and wellness coach, it's really hard because you haven't practiced having communication with other people in this kind of really reflective, open way. Typically, it's a conversation back and forth, but remember, as a health and wellness coach, it's really important that we take a step back and that the conversation is very client-focused. So here are some kind of common traps that we want to avoid. The assessment trap, we talked about this earlier. And this is when we as coaches spend way too much time asking our clients a series of questions. And they're usually one directional and usually they're not really useful to us or the client. It kind of shuts down that process of engagement. I will tell you, when I first started coaching, I fell into that assessment trap so much. And the reason why is because I got my undergrad in exercise science and my master's degree in exercise science, where no one ever talked to me about kind of these theories and these tools that I can use to coach people. All I was taught was, here's you do an assessment and I need to know everything about your assessment before I can move forward. And so this is a very different way of doing that, like I mentioned before. We also want to avoid the expert trap, and this is where we portray ourselves as the expert who has the answer for our clients. And if we do that, then we're taking ownership of the change process rather than our clients. And remember, that's the exact opposite. And the science and theory behind health and wellness coaching is that it's actually our clients who are taking the ownership of the change, not us. Okay, so it's again activating that writing reflex and kind of putting that to the side. The premature focus trap, and this is when we really start to focus too much on something in the beginning and we kind of hone in on it, and so we spend so much time on that we don't get to any of the other behaviors or things that we want to discuss. And so it's important for the conversation to start with the client's concerns, not that of our coach. So even, for instance, if we see that in the assessment, if we see that our client has a BMI of, say, 42, but we also see in our assessment that they are regularly physically active, that they have really great markers, their blood markers are great, they have low blood pressure, there's no any other signs, right, of bad health. We could be tempted, because of our background, to say right away, well, they need to focus on weight loss. But I'm going to blow your minds for a second. They might not have that as a goal because they are comfortable being bigger. And because they're bigger, at the same time, because they're physically active and they have all these other really positive health markers, that might not be their goal, and it shouldn't be your job as a coach to tell them that, right? It is up to them and what they want to change. And so that's that premature focus trap. And it's really easy to engage in, especially in our field. So watch yourself with that one. The labeling trap, and this is when the coach wants to name the problem. So, oh, it's the smoking problem, or this is an example, obesity, right? It seems like you have an issue with obesity. I hope you would never say that, but again, these are things to think about, or diabetes. Because if you name the problem, what often happens is that there is a stigma related to that. automatically we know that there's a stigma related to smoking. There is a stigma related to obesity, and there's a stigma related to diabetes. We know from scientific literature that people, if we learn that someone is a smoker or is obese or is diabetic, that we have these implicit and sometimes explicit biases that exist. And so it's really important that we do not show any of that. Even though that might implicitly live there, we need to put it to the side and work on that bias, but we also need to make sure that our clients don't feel that way. So avoid labeling as much as you can, okay? Then there's this blaming trap, and this is when the client may feel guilty or feel that the coach will blame them for a problem. So it's really important from the start that the coach kind of disarm that client and acknowledge that the coach is not concerned with who is to blame for the problem, but rather kind of understanding better what the problem is and how the client can best address it. So again, there's some guilt in some of these behaviors. There's guilt in being obese, right? Studies show that. There's guilt in someone who smokes. So it's important that you address this and say, you know, I don't really, there's no need to feel guilty, right? If I'm talking to my client, there's no need to feel guilty. And I hope you know, I'm not trying to put any blame. All I want to do right now is I want to explore this a little bit more. I want to learn a little bit more about this behavior. So I just want to say that from the very beginning so that you feel comfortable and just know that blaming will have no help in this process, right? So sometimes it might be as simple as kind of acknowledging it with your client from the very get-go, especially if you can read them and if you can sense that they're a little uncomfortable. From the very get-go, just kind of put it out there on the table and just say, hey, we're human, right? We all engage in behaviors that sometimes make us feel guilty, and sometimes society makes us feel guilty for that. But that won't really help us right now. What will help us is for us to better understand the problem and how we can kind of move forward. And then lastly is the chat trap. And so this is when we spend way too much time on small talk rather than moving forward with the agenda. Where this tends to happen the most is when it's a brand new client, and so you have more comfort in that small talk because you're maybe a little bit nervous and or your client is nervous to kind of move forward and dig into the deep stuff. So that's where it could happen. Or I have found with my clients that I've had for years, sometimes they've become more like friends, right? Because you've worked with them for so long, you know a lot about their life, you feel very connected to them, and so it could be very easy to engage in some of that small chit chat before you get into the big stuff. So make sure that even if, for me, for instance, I've had a client that I've had for 3 years and she meets with me every few months just to kind of check in. I always set a little timer for myself for about 5 minutes so that I can make sure that I reserve the majority of the time to be with them speaking about the things that they are paying us to talk with us about. And then concluding the visit. So the client should have a summary plan, and that could be electronic, could be written, and it should include the following information. If there's measurements that you did that are applicable, establishing a goal, so hopefully you kind of got to that goal process. If there's any quote-unquote homework that needs to happen, or things that, even if you don't call it homework, things that you want your client to do before meeting with you again. Any responsibilities of the coach. So I'm going to follow up and do this, right? An accountability plan, and then also, and this is really important, when you are going to meet with them next. So here's a nice example that your book provides, and again, this could be electronic or it could be on a paper format. But I also wanted to provide you kind of a real life version of what I use, right? And so again, all of my coaching is virtual, and this is kind of that follow-up piece that I use with my clients. And it has a lot of those components that I just discussed. It talks about their goals, what things that they mentioned that were really important to them. I always have how we're going to meet next, and that I use Zoom. I have things that I'm gonna follow up on. I have things that I'm asking them to follow up on in a nice kind of concise manner. Okay, and you can see kind of the formatting that I'm using, so it's easy to understand and read. So I just want to provide you with an example of what I use in real life. It's also important that you have kind of this standard way of taking notes, right? And the reason why is because you're going to reflect back on these notes and reference them for future meetings when you meet with your client. And it should be a standard format. And things that you want to think about include life stressors that your client might express to you, any major changes that are happening, any maybe injuries or illnesses that they have, and then upcoming events. And for me personally, I used to take paper notes and I'd put it in my little client folder, and that was great. But what I found was when I was taking paper notes, especially virtually, what would happen is my eyes would go down here and I would be writing and I wouldn't be able to make as much eye contact with my client. So what I started to do is I started to take electronic notes. And for me, I use Dropbox, and Dropbox has a feature called Paper. And Paper is a really nice way of including documentation. You can search for them, you can add in different things. It's very, very handy. So that way, as I'm looking at them, I'm typing and taking notes, but still able to see them. You can do it via Google, you could do using Word documents or whatever you want to do, okay? But those are just some options. Okay, so let's do a quick lesson recap here. First question, what are some common traps for engagement? We went over a number of them, so think through those and kind of understand them and maybe even think about how you might struggle with some of them. And then lastly, what are some things to consider when concluding a visit? What are things you need to do? What are topics you need to bring up? So make sure we understand that, and then we will go on to the next set of lectures.